Doğup ölgen kuchilarda Ümit üzme aziz halqim Ümit üzme ey ana yurt Biz atlandık bu küreşke Uyul taştak uyuşup Allah verse bu nusretni Bizgilerimiz sep bulup Zalimlarını yığlatgudek Uğuz gibi küçlük bulup Lepildeydi asminanda Göz çaknitip şu günü Ay yıldızlık gök bayrağım Ey ana makan Ay yıldızlık gök bayrağım
Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. Welcome to another episode on Talk to East Turkestan. We have a very special guest joining us all the way from the United States. We have Dr. Sean R. Roberts. We'll be talking to him about his new book, The War on the Uyghurs, China's Internal Campaign Against the Muslim Minority. Before I get the doctor on the show, I just want to give a little bit of background information on him. Dr. Sean R. Roberts is the director of the International Development Studies program at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. He has a master's degree in visual anthropology and a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Southern Carolina. He has been studying the Uyghur people for 30 years, ever since his first trip to the Uyghur homeland in 1990. Dr. Roberts made a documentary on the Uyghurs of the China-Kazakhstan borderlands for his MA thesis in 1996 and completed his PhD dissertation on this community in 2003. So, and also he has been conducting ongoing field research with the Uyghurs around the world ever since, and he reads and speaks the Uyghur language. This book is the product of his long-term research and employs a wide range of Uyghur language sources, including interviews with Uyghurs, as well as Uyghur language documents and videos, which have previously not been analyzed in academic works. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we really do have an expert on the show today. And I'm so thrilled after, having such little time with his book, going through most of it today. Hopefully we'll have a fruitful discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sean Roberts. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
Excellent. How is it over there? We see a lot of mayhem, at least on the news, depending on what's on your news feed.
Yeah, I think it's a somewhat tumultuous time in the United States, and particularly with the pandemic and kind of the poor response of the government, but we're getting by, and I think I'm hopeful that everything will turn back to normalcy in the near future.
Excellent. I hope so as well. Basically, I want, just at the beginning, before we get into the gist of things, I've talked about your background briefly, but if you could, from your own mouth, tell us your background with the Uyghurs, how you got started, and how you've seen things change over the years since your interaction with the Uyghurs and the Uyghur homeland in general, and then we'll get stuck into the book.
So, yeah, I initially in college was interested in Marxism, and I started studying communist countries. This was during the 1980s, and I was somewhat suspicious of Ronald Reagan's characterization of the Soviet Union as a evil empire. And I had my first opportunity to live in a socialist state in Yugoslavia. And when I got to Yugoslavia in 1987, I realized nobody was interested in Marxism or socialism. but really, the interesting issues happening in Yugoslavia at the time were nationalism, and particularly the relationship between Muslim peoples in the country and non-Muslim peoples, and how that kind of intertwined with nationalism. So I decided I wanted to study Islam in the Soviet Union, and I had an opportunity in 1989 to study in Tashkent in the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic before it was independent Uzbekistan. And what I found there was not really a lot of tension between the indigenous Uzbek people and the Soviet state. There was certainly a degree of racism, like you would see in any multi-ethnic, multinational state, but Uzbeks, were not ready to overthrow the Soviet Union or demand independence. And during my winter break, I went to the Uyghur region of China and found a very different situation. I found that Uyghurs were very uncomfortable with the Chinese state and their homeland being a part of the Chinese state. Most Uyghurs, in 1989-90 did not speak the Chinese language. They spoke Uyghur. And so then from that point on, I decided that I wanted to study, in particular, the situation of Uyghurs. And I went to graduate school and went back to do research for my dissertation and the documentary you mentioned, which I made both in China, in the Uyghur region, and in Kazakhstan, where there's also a very significant Uyghur population.
And so that was the sort of start with it. And how have you seen the Uyghurs? So I guess from 89, 90, how have you seen things change?
Yeah, no, I have seen a lot of change in that time period. I mean, I think I went there first in January 1990. And one of the things that was very striking to me was that compared to the Soviet Union, in the Uyghur region of China, there was a much freer approach to religion. There were a lot of mosques. There were people studying Islam. The culture was, I would say, more intact. And also at the same time, what was very clear to me was that the Chinese state was had not really succeeded in creating any kind of acculturation or assimilation of Uyghurs. So it was almost as if it wasn't part of the Chinese state. Whereas in the Soviet Union, if you've ever been to Soviet Central Asia, the Russian influence is significant everywhere. And the Soviet influence is very significant. I mean, just in terms of construction and so on. So the Uyghur region in 1990 was very underdeveloped. And it was very much had a Uyghur character to it. Even in a place like Urumqi, which I witnessed, throughout the 1990s become less and less, having less and less of a Uyghur character, and being more a center of Han culture and Chinese state culture. But I even began to see that, gradually throughout the 1990s, as you saw development happening in the south near Kashgar and Hotan. But what was interesting is by the end of the 1990s, the south of the Uyghur region remained overwhelmingly Uyghur. I mean, you would go out to I remember going to a rural area outside of Hotan, and you would not see a Han in sight. You would not hear Chinese spoken, and it was very much a Uyghur milieu. So I think that you started to see that at the end of the 1990s. I actually a book came out that I wrote a chapter in called Xinjiang, China's Muslim Borderlands, that came out, I think, in 2003. And after that, all the scholars who had written there were essentially banned from going back to China. So I did not witness a lot of the things happening in the 2000s, but followed them very closely, and also followed them both through Uyghurs who were leaving the region, partially on the other side of the border in Kazakhstan, partially in Turkey, in Europe, in the US. And also, in terms of interacting with my colleagues who continue to have access to the region, other scholars such as Joanne Smith Finley and Rachel Harris, other anthropologists who continue to go back. And it seems that we really started to see in the 2000s, I think, a dual kind of approach from the Chinese state. On the one hand, it was pushing development. It was pushing trying to integrate this region and its people more into modern China. And on the other hand, it was viciously attacking any signs of Uyghur descent, which is why you had this continual out-migration of Uyghur refugees throughout the 2000s. And then that build up, of course, to the 2009 events in Urumqi, where you had essentially ethnic riots between Uyghurs and Han. And I saw that as something of a kind of a boiling over of tension created by the state's development push and the state's encouragement of Han in migration, and the feeling among many Uyghurs that their homeland seemed to be under siege. And then the other thing, which I do talk about in the book, is I think post 2001, after 9/11, the attitude towards Uyghurs changed dramatically. I would say it was gradual. Not immediately was there a significant change, but I remember, shortly after 9/11. Meeting with Uyghur scholars in Kazakhstan, and them asking me, what happened where the U.S. Is starting to view Uyghurs as a terrorist force, and the entire international community, I think, would kind of internalize that whole discourse that, well, the Uyghurs suffer a lot of human rights abuses in China, but they are a threat. And we understand why China is maybe instituting some of these aggressive policies. So I think, since 9/11, and particularly since 2002, when the U.S. and the UN recognized a Uyghur terrorist group, which I talk about a lot in the book, that whole terrorism discourse is kind of hung over, I think, Uyghurs as a people like a dark cloud. It's been it's kind of been used as a justification not to trust Uyghur activists, and to have a certain kind of understanding of why China is cracking down on Uyghurs.
Yeah, there seems to be, as you mentioned in the book, the word terrorist seems to be used so willy-nilly, where you can just put this name on a predominantly Muslim population, and then therefore we suddenly become we are suddenly not human. And we are just like, and China is doing the right thing, because there is this notion that, China, ancient culture, there has to be a problem. They're not doing this for no reason. And today, and you point this out in the book very clearly, which I commend you for, the country which is calling out, the number one country that's calling out the human rights atrocities against China, is the United States, the country and their allies, which started the global war on terror.
Mhm.
And they themselves have, at the beginning of the 21st century, carried out so many atrocities. And I wrote in a tweet a few hours ago, now I understand why people don't really care about genocides or cultural genocides or whatever you want to call them, because the champions of these human rights themselves destroyed them at the beginning of the century.
Yeah, yeah. No, I very much agree with that. I mean, I think one of the things when I started researching this book, and I started researching it before the beginning of the present situation, which I kind of mark at 2017, when things got really, really bad in the Uyghur region of China, you know, and you started to see the mass internment camps being built and people disappearing and so on. And I started doing the research prior to this to focus on this issue of how the war on terror had impacted Uyghurs. And one of the first things that really surprised me when I started researching this issue was that, you know, after 15 years of the U.S. being in a war against terrorism, there's no international consensus on what terrorism means. What is a terrorist? You know, I think, and I try in the book to outline what I see as a legitimate definition of terrorism, you know, which is political violence, premeditated political violence that deliberately targets innocent civilians. You know, because I think that's when anybody in the world thinks about terrorism, that's what they see as being reprehensible, right? It doesn't have to have anything to do with Islam. I mean, terrorism has a long history of people taking out, using political violence against innocent civilians to make a political point, and that's what I see as terrorism. And because there is no international consensus, I think that states have been able to use that term in all different ways. And I think, you know, one thing that's important to understand is I do think the Chinese state has a particularly unique understanding of what they call terrorists. You know, and it comes from this concept of the three evils. Separatism, extremism, and terrorism, those three concepts essentially blend together for the Chinese state. So, if the Chinese state sees anybody advocating for self-determination, they feel that is terrorism. You know, which is why you'll see sometimes the Chinese state referring to Tibetan terrorism or Hong Kong terrorism. And, you know, in the West, where terrorism has also, I think, wrongly been associated with Islam, that seems very odd to talk about Tibetan terrorists and Hong Kong terrorists. But I think that's the way the Chinese state views it. They really view attempts at self-determination to be a sign of terrorism. So, you know, and with the Uyghurs, they have since 9/11, you know, really also associated that with Islam, which is why I think that part of what's happening since 2017 in the Uyghur homeland is a full-out assault on any kind of religious identity, religious behavior, and you know, of course, that blends into just Uyghur culture. Because, you know, so much of Uyghur culture has associations with Islam. So, you know, I think that this blurred line between self-determination, Islam, you know, self-determination defined by the Chinese state as separatism, Islam defined as extremism, and terrorism defined as any sort of political violence, and in sometimes not even violence, you know, just political advocacy. You know, because I mean, one of the things right after 9/11, the Chinese state was trying to say that all Uyghur political activists abroad were connected with Al Qaeda, and that argument never stuck in the West, because people knew a lot of activists, who were secular, who weren't advocating violence, maybe weren't even advocating independence for the Uyghur homeland, but were just advocating for human rights. But this label did stick to one organization, one very small group of Uyghurs who were in Afghanistan at the time.
So would you agree, I mean, the extent or the speed or the acceleration that China has been able to take out these atrocities, do you blame it or do you put it on the global war on terror? Or would China still have carried out these atrocities regardless of the global war on terror? Like, does the West, on the global war on terror, do they have input on this? Have they played a part in atrocities, which I sort of feel that's what I got from your book?
Yeah, no, I do think, I mention both in the introduction and conclusion, I say very certainly, the things that the Chinese state is perpetrating against Uyghurs, the Chinese state should be held accountable for that. That is their activities. They're the ones who, are implementing a group of policies that are essentially seeking to wipe out Uyghur identity. But the West has been very complicit and has helped facilitate that. You see this now. I know you had mentioned earlier that you've interacted with a lot of the kind of people who are denying that there are gross human rights abuses in the Uyghur region and so on, and they'll constantly refer to double standards of the United States, and they'll say, well, this is the way China deals with terrorism. The United States, also used torture and used assassinations and used mass surveillance. And I do think that the scale of what's happening to Uyghurs is a little bit different in the sense that, the United States carried out these human rights abuses, targeting specific groups abroad who were involved in militancy, where in China it's been used against the entire population. But I do think that the West has played a part in this, and that's part of the reason that I think also, particularly post-Iraq war, a lot of people in developing countries don't really trust the United States. They see the United States using military power to change what's happening inside a state, inside a weaker state, and they're prone to arguments that this is the United States making up these things about Uyghurs, and of course that's exacerbated by the fact that most of the world doesn't know a lot about the Uyghur people and their history.
We mention a lot of these things. We talk about, say, beer drinking competitions and or forced eating of pork or forced marriages. And we do have a lot of clips, but you can interpret those clips in many different ways coming off the Chinese social media.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you do mention the mixed marriages.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about proving this to your fellow constituents or the Western world? Because in the clips, the people look fairly happy. And obviously we say, well, if they disagreed with that, then that's when they'll be persecuted. But we can't actually prove it. Or is there a way we can prove it?
Well, I mean, I think it is difficult to prove, partially because, it's so difficult to have any sort of independent voices coming out of the Uyghur region in China. I mean, it's virtually impossible. But, one of the ways that I frame what's happening right now in the book is, people around the world have heard about the mass internment camps, and they immediately think about concentration camps, in history in the past, And that is, of course, reprehensible and immediately, evocative of all kinds of feelings. But that's only really part of what's happening, because I think that it's at the center of a network of policies. What I really see the Chinese state is trying to do is to essentially colonize the Uyghur region, to make it a generic part of China, and essentially marginalize the Uyghurs, displace a lot of them. So right now we see a lot of things happening with labor programs that are meant to take Uyghurs out of their native villages and put them in residential factories. And that seems very much like kind of an ethnic cleansing, moving them out. But I think that if that's the motive, why do you have these camps, and why do you have the mass surveillance, which are the two things that have been most talked about in media, have been best documented, but those create a sense of complete fear in the community. So essentially your choice, if you're a Uyghur, is do things that the state wants you to do, or you're going to be either put in an internment camp, or worse, you're going to be arrested as an extremist. And the Chinese state has established legal means to describe all kinds of behavior as extremist. In fact, one of the signs of extremism is if you prevent somebody from marrying somebody of a different ethnic group. Yeah. So, if you're a Uyghur and a Han asks for your hand in marriage, denying that is essentially a criminal act. And the state could put you in prison, and they could put your family in prison, because they could say, well, your family said you couldn't marry this person. So you have all of this, all of this fear that essentially I think is making any Uyghurs who are not in incarceration of some sort, whether that's camps or prisons, it's making them have to follow anything that state officials are suggesting, whether it's, partaking in a beer drinking competition, or marrying a Han Chinese, or eating pork, or whatever. I mean, so I think it, and at the same time, I think there seems to be a lot of evidence that this situation in the Uyghur homeland is breaking down any sense of community. People can accuse each other of being extremists. It's like you may both be Uyghurs, but your neighbor, you don't like for whatever reason. You can get rid of your neighbor by reporting them to the Public Security Bureau and saying, this person is an extremist and this is why I think this. And then that person could disappear. So people are not, the social capital of the community is being broken down, and people are afraid to even discuss what's happening, because they know that there's omnipresent surveillance, which has been well documented. It's probably the most surveilled region in the entire world, in multiple lines of surveillance, and also leading into a huge database that provides information about any individual Uyghur that may come into the sight lines of the police or the Public Security Bureau.
You mentioned that there seems to be a softening of policy, and that sooner or later China will actually open its doors. And we've seen recently the foreign ministry actually say, we will let the EU independent investigators in one. And yesterday I read a report about, first, remember when the concentration camps first made the news, they denied them. Then they called them vocational camps. Then they said the numbers weren't in the millions. It was a few thousand, or I believe the number was anywhere between 30 to 50,000. Now they've come and said, we've been, detaining them Indirectly, they've been saying we've been detaining them from 2014 to 19, 1.3 million each year, which racks up to about almost 7 million each year if we were to, add them. Why are they coming out with this information? Obviously, we're going to interpret it as arbitrary detainment, but why are they coming out with this information now?
Well, I think, part of what you're referring to is the statistic in this white paper where they're talking about re-education.
Yeah.
I think this relates, to the answer to your question. In that white paper, they blur the lines of what re-education is. One of the things we've learned is there's been a process underway almost throughout this whole period where there have been labor programs that have kind of this re-education light. I call it re-education light because they're not necessarily in a prison-like environment. But again, it's, your choice to participate in this re-education and labor program, is coerced, because if you don't, then you're an extremist and you go to a prison or an internment camp. So I think those numbers, I don't think that means that, there's been necessarily 7 million in the internment camps, but it shows you the scale. That's 7 million. There's officially, a little bit over 11 million Uyghurs in the China, in the Uyghur region of China. And that means, that's almost all the adults, right, are being subjected to some form of re-education. And, one of the things when I wrote, my book was finished and was ready to be published at the beginning of the summer. And the publishers said, well, with the pandemic, we think it's better if we wait until the fall to release it. But they gave me the opportunity to write a preface about how the pandemic has impacted this. And, we don't know the real answer to that question. The information coming out of the region has gotten even more narrow since last March, and that's both because the region has been closed down, people are not traveling, and also China has expulsed much of the many of the journalists, international journalists who had been covering this issue. And the one thing I do say in that preface is that I think we are seeing something of a normalization of the situation, where the Chinese state is maybe going to try to start repurposing these camps already at the beginning, or already, I guess, about this time last year. Officials in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region said they were starting to close down these camps, and people were graduating from them. So I could see, an attempt to close many of them and really shift to these residential labor programs. I'm sure they would retain some of the camps, again, to make sure you can instill this fear. But what I worry about is during the time of the pandemic, and once China does acquiesce to allow independent investigators to come see what's happening in the region, that they could erase a lot of the evidence of the tactics that have been used to essentially immobilize and make docile the Uyghur population and marginalize them. So, you could come to a region, a year from now where Uyghurs, most Uyghur villages are not Uyghur villages anymore. Most Uyghurs are working in factories, whether it's in the Uyghur region or elsewhere in China, where they are under so much fear that they're, if they're interviewed by people, they're not going to say anything negative about the state. So, I worry that is a process that may be happening. And I think we'll only know when people have access to the region again.
As a Uyghur expert, could you please explain to my audience, and I have difficulty explaining this, that East Turkestan is not the same as other regions where, for example, you could have independent investigators in Syria, in Iran, in Iraq, in Rohingya, in Kashmir, in Yemen, in wherever, and you could find evidence. And I would find, let's just say, independent investigators do go in. I find it to be very futile because China are so good in covering up their tracks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, it's going back to the 1990s, there's always been, it's always been very difficult for anybody outside to do research in this region. There's always been a significant amount of surveillance. There are repercussions for people who interact with outside researchers. So I think as we did start to see more and more Western researchers enter the area by the later 90s, there was also an attempt to really kind of keep them in Urumqi, which was an area that, as I mentioned, was becoming more Chinese in character, and a lot of the Uyghurs there were essentially starting to acculturate to Chinese culture and spoke Chinese and so on. And I've talked with some of my other colleagues about this. That I think has also distorted the view of the region itself as being more Urumqi centric, where what we see starting in 2014 in particular, and then definitely by 2017, is the Chinese state is most concerned about that southern region, which is overwhelmingly Uyghur. And as an anthropologist, the reason I did research in Kazakhstan initially is I knew I could not live, with a Uyghur family in a rural area inside China. That was just impossible. The state would not allow that. But the situation now has become far worse. I think right now there's essentially nobody who can get access to the region from the outside unless it's on a fully curated tour. I think you even saw this over the last 3 years with Western journalists who tried to go in and film where the camps were, and they'd be chased by police and I think now, right now there's virtually no access. I've seen, no reports where people have even gotten into the region in the last year. So I think that you're right. It would be very difficult. And I've thought about this, since this began. I think it's really important. I think it would be important to bring in people who have a lot of experience in the region, and people also who maybe have a lot of experience with mass atrocities, who could see the signs of things, because, certainly when I see the videos from these curated press tours to the camps, I look at them and I can see what's happening. Whereas, maybe a journalist who has never been to the region, can be fooled by that. But, I can see that these people, are completely, under fear. We had that reaction from the one journalist from Albania who went and could just see through what was happening. He said he talked to people about Islam and he realized they could not talk about Islam. That this was, as a Muslim himself, he was, horrified by that. He could see that these people were completely under duress and feared saying anything.
One interesting part that you mentioned in the book, and this sort of hits home, where you mentioned the Uyghur cultural figures, professors, writers, musicians, actors. They've been given straight up prison sentences. And I'm lucky enough because my father-in-law is a famous actor and comedian, and he was out. He spent about 10 months in there, and he was out. And now a lot of CCP supporters or people that advocate for the CCP, they use that against me, or they use that against the Uyghur cause. Well, your father-in-law's a famous actor, and now, you know, he's very well assimilated. He's talking Uyghur on shows. He's living the high life.
Mm-hmm.
How come some cultural figureheads get prison sentences, no re-education, just prison, and some are let out and they do their thing, or at least it looks like they're doing their thing?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. It kind of reminds me, of when I was doing dissertation research, and I was looking at the history of the Uyghurs in the Soviet Union. And I was looking at the Stalinist purges that happened in the 1930s, and you had this same question, why were the overwhelming majority of people essentially, sent to prison camps or killed? And there were some of these cultural figures who were allowed out and were allowed to, participate in society and were presenting, loyalty to the state. I hate to, it's difficult to speculate, but, I spoke to one Uyghur who was from Kazakhstan, who had looked at the archives from this time, and he was a scholar of Uyghur literature. And he told me about the vicious ways that people had sold each other out. And I said, you should write an article about that. And he said, no, there's no reason to write an article about it because, these people's families are still alive. Their children and grandchildren are alive. Why drag their names through the mud? And I think in these situations, to be completely fair, it's difficult if any one of us put ourselves in that place. Are you willing to sell out your friends and family to survive or not? And I think some people aren't even presented with that opportunity, but some of them are obviously presented with an opportunity like that. And, it's a very difficult ethical question to answer what any given individual would do. So I do think, I think time will tell. One of the things that I have to say about the Uyghur people in general is that they're very resilient. And I've always found that, Uyghur culture in art and literature in particular has always been very innovative in the ways that it resists kind of Chinese control. And so it'll be interesting to see, whether some of these people who are getting out and who are producing things, if we're going to see them send any messages of resistance through what they do, or whether they're just going to mimic what, the party wants them to say.
True. Okay. The term cultural genocide. Okay. So as soon as we add this term cultural, it seems to soften up the word. But in your book, you say, cultural genocide is still a powerful thing. It's a powerful label. And what came to my mind was China's going to carry out its cultural genocide, say, raise mosques, cemeteries, language, and they'll pretty much kill the people who resist that change or resist that form of genocide. And therefore, you wouldn't need to kill a whole population of people. And you say China's end game is not necessarily to cull or have a Holocaust type situation.
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's two important points here. One is that, maybe in popular discourse, cultural genocide softens the term genocide, but from a perspective of the UN Convention on Genocide, or from the perspective of the person who coined the phrase genocide, who was a Polish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, they talked about it as trying to destroy a group of people, an ethnic group, a nation. They did not describe it as necessarily the physical extermination of people. I think since the Holocaust, in popular discourse, people always associate genocide with mass physical extermination. And as bad as what we're seeing happening in the Uyghur homeland right now, I don't think, there is mass physical extermination. But what we are seeing is it does have precedent historically. And one of the reasons I use the term cultural genocide is because I think that what's happening is much more akin to what's happened to indigenous nations around the world through settler colonialism. You can see a lot of the things that are happening to Uyghurs. They happened to Native Americans in the 19th century. And sometimes you'll see even, people who are supporting China's policy towards Uyghurs saying, well, the US did this in the 19th century.
Australia did it.
Yeah. Australia did it. Yeah. And that doesn't make it right,
Yeah.
And it doesn't make it right in the 21st century. So I do think that, what they're trying to do is decimate kind of the nation as opposed to the individuals. So they're trying to destroy any sense of community. They're trying to depopulate. Certainly, there's evidence of mass sterilizations. There's evidence of trying to coerce interethnic marriage. There's evidence of, putting people through a lot of physical duress that may end up in their death. So I would imagine, if the Chinese state is successful in what it's trying to do, they're going to depopulate the Uyghurs as a people. And those who remain will be very marginalized. They may even end up having something akin to reservations, where people are isolated in certain areas, and I think, another thing that we're seeing happen is while this is happening to the Uyghur people, the Chinese state is changing the landscape of the Uyghur homeland. And I think most of the Uyghur characteristics that are going to remain are those that will be found useful for tourism. So we saw kind of an early manifestation of that when there was the destruction of the Kashgar Old City to build this kind of modern version of it that can be, used as kind of a Disneyland of Uyghur culture.
Yeah, and eventually you said we wouldn't necessarily need the term Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region anymore. It will just be named Xinjiang because the Uyghurs necessarily won't exist. There'll be just like this shell and just like Hanified Uyghurs essentially. Correct?
Yeah, no, I could see that, very well taking place. Some of my colleagues who are looking at, in comparative perspective, the Chinese state's relationship with non-Han peoples are also noting that what's happening to the Uyghurs is happening simultaneously with kind of a greater campaign to wipe out any cultural diversity, and perhaps even get rid of the idea of ethnic nations themselves. Some of the proponents of this idea, who are Chinese academics who've been around for a while, have compared it to the United States and said, well, in the United States, in your passport, it doesn't say Uyghur, Irish, British, whatever, it says American. And, they're also gradually cutting back on any kind of affirmative action programs that they had in the past. So there is a sense that you could see the idea of autonomous regions just being taken away. And this certainly is relevant to what's happening in Mongolia right now, or this campaign against the Mongolian language. So I could see, autonomous regions, whether it's Hong Kong or the Uyghur Autonomous Region, or the Tibetan Autonomous Region, or the Mongolian Autonomous Region. I could see them just disappearing from the state system of topography.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a bit. I want to question one of the things that you wrote. You wrote here that those who have refused to submit to the whitewashing of their culture and either willful assimilation or self-marginalization likely will remain incarcerated indefinitely. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason why I want to question this is because, are you saying that there is, we gather that there is no room for rebuttal against what's happening to anyone? So how could one tell that they are not submitting or not assimilating? Because they could easily say, no, I submit, I follow your rules, and they'd be out technically.
Yeah.
So do you believe that there is room for no submission?
I do not. I think this is somewhat speculative, right? Because we none of us have been in a camp.
Yeah.
But reading, kind of the eyewitness accounts and so on, it seems that the people who get severely punished, who are subjected to torture and so on, are the ones who do resist.
Yeah.
Which would suggest that, the only way to kind of survive with any kind of humanity is to submit completely, right? In history, there are lots of examples of this where, again, I can point to the Stalinist purges. You can point to the Cultural Revolution, where people, Cultural Revolution in China, people have to, kind of in a performative way, whether they believe or not, they have to agree that they're with everything they're told to agree with, right? It's difficult to know. It goes back to your question about your father-in-law. What allows people out of the system of incarceration? How do they convince the state to allow them out? Or, another possibility is, just like most of the internment was arbitrary at the beginning, that there may be just kind of an arbitrariness of let's put these people out. I know that, some of the activists in Kazakhstan who've been trying to document people have suggested that they think sometimes if you bring international attention to a specific person's case, that gets them out of the internment. And sometimes that seems to work and sometimes it doesn't. And why? So I think, we'll only know the full story of this, when we get a critical mass of survivors, and particularly people, most of the eyewitnesses we've had didn't spend this entire 3 years in camps.
Yeah.
Maybe when we hear from people like that, we'll get a better idea of, who was allowed out and why. And of course, any kind of system like that where people are, kind of divided among those who submit and those who resist, is extremely destructive to the community itself. Because people, again, going back to, for example, the Stalinist purges in the Soviet Union, people, held grudges for generations about people who sold out their family members. It's just I think a reality of that kind of very brutal existence that, people to survive sometimes may have to sell out each other.
Yeah, because even if I'm not mistaken, you mentioned this in the book, the 48 ways to end up in a internment camp. One of them, well, if you had the opportunity to sell out someone and you didn't, then you would actually go to the camp. So you have no choice but to. I've got this question here. You've talked to many Uyghurs on the outside, all over the world. It says CCP has borderless ideological concentration camps for the Uyghurs outside China. Can we talk about it?
Yeah. Actually, that's something that I'm going to try to do some research on over the next year. Actually, is it's interesting. Certainly, the Chinese government is putting extensive pressure on people like yourself, any Uyghurs abroad who are speaking out about this. And I think it might be overstating it to say it's borderless concentration camp, because otherwise I don't think you would be broadcasting this right now. But I do think that it's reflective of something that's happening with a lot of authoritarian states around the world, where they're finding with new technology and so on that they're able to punish dissent even when it's outside their borders. And so actually I'm working on an article about this with the Uyghur case that's going to be in a book that's a comparative book that looks at several different cases. Some of the former Soviet states, Tajikistan has been assassinating dissidents who are in Istanbul, and Russia obviously has had a lot of experience kind of stifling dissent that's outside its borders. But the Uyghur case is particularly intense, I think, because of maybe because of this expansive database that they're producing on Uyghurs. And a lot of the stories I've heard from Uyghurs is that they've been called by people from the Chinese security organs and asked for extensive information about their address, about where they work. And one can only imagine that this is all being put into a massive database. So what's particularly worrisome about this is not the harassment that's taken place thus far, but is whether, there's going to be further harassment, and whether, the tracking of Uyghurs outside China is going to be something that the Chinese state is going to be able to use for all kinds of nefarious acts against these people. Certainly right now, I think that the intent is to create fear, to stop people from speaking. And, I think that's been successful in some cases, but, I've also talked to a lot of people who for a long time were silent and then finally said, I'm just going to speak out because it doesn't seem that being silent is helping my family members who are interned, so I might as well speak out. So yeah, it is a very troubling development, and I have I saw it when I visited Norway. I saw it when I visited Turkey. I hear it in the United States, and I think it's pretty much something that the Chinese government is implementing globally.
A sort of a touchy subject I want to bring up now. We talked about it just before we started the interview. Now, as activists, as Uyghur rights organizations, as groups, we tend to not affiliate or talk about or stay away from topics like ETIM, TIP, because they've been labeled as terrorist organizations by many countries around the world. But you have a slightly different take on it.
Well, I can completely understand the perspective of activists. As a scholar, it's been my intent to kind of try to understand these groups and what they really are. And, I mentioned in my book, I think a lot is still shrouded in mystery about them.
Mhm.
I've met representatives of the Turkestan Islamic Party, and I've interviewed them. I've talked to people who've been associated with the Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement, which actually never called itself that. But there certainly still is a lot shrouded in mystery. But one of the things I think that happened with the global war on terror is, even about a group where there wasn't much information, you had this kind of industry of terrorism analysts who were producing information about groups, and the tenor of their work is very confident. They basically say, "Oh yes, this is what this group is all about," and when you interrogate their sources, there's not much there's not much information. So I tried to kind of dismantle that a bit in looking at these groups. I think the first group you mentioned, ETIM, I don't think that was ever a terrorist organization or ever a group aligned with Al Qaeda. The evidence about this group that I've been able to dig up was that you had one religiously inspired Uyghur nationalist who left the country, went abroad, tried to get resources from the Uyghur diaspora in Turkey and Saudi Arabia, but pretty much unsuccessfully, but ended up trying to start a training ground in Afghanistan to start an insurgency to liberate the Uyghur homeland. Now, he was eventually killed by the Pakistani military in 2003. He kind of came to Afghanistan with this intent to establish this project at the wrong time, right before 9/11. Yeah. Evidence suggests that they had very strained relations with Al Qaeda. Because they weren't interested in global jihad. They were just interested in liberating the Uyghur homeland. And further evidence suggests that the Taliban essentially tried to quarantine them and prevent them from doing anything. Because the Taliban was in close discussions with the Chinese state at the time. So that group, I don't see, that was the group that was initially identified as the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement and branded a terrorist group by the United States and then by the UN, again with the help of the United States in 2002. I think that group was completely inconsequential and not at all part of global jihadism. You do have a few Uyghurs who, in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, end up in Waziristan, Pakistan. And it's a very small number, but they become very prolific in video production. And how easy it is to do video production. So you had a few Uyghurs who I don't think really constituted a fighting force at all, but probably were sprinkled among foreign fighting forces in northwest Pakistan at the time, in Waziristan. And that group starts producing a lot of videos that calls itself the Turkestan Islamic Party, and that really feeds into the Chinese state's propaganda about Uyghur terrorism, and maybe to a certain extent into Chinese state fears of potential for radicalization of the Uyghur population as a whole. But this group itself, I think, in one terrorism expert, to his credit, mentions, they were really more of a video production group with a fighting force than a fighting force with a video production unit. They were really not very consequential. But what happens, in the aftermath of the Urumqi riots in 2009, when you have all these Uyghurs fleeing the country to Turkey, and a lot of them going through Southeast Asia, is this group is able to recruit a significant number of Uyghurs to go to Syria. So by 2013, there is a significant number of Uyghurs fighting in Syria. I wouldn't, in the definition I use for terrorism, which, as I mentioned, is, political violence that deliberately targets innocent civilians. I don't think there should be considered a terrorist group. They're really a mercenary group. They do believe in global jihad, at least their leaders, and at least by their videos. But the people who go to join them in Syria, a lot of them, some of them just go there because they have no financial means in Turkey, and they're told that in Syria, they'll be given a place to live, they'll be given food, their kids can go to school, and others think that they're going to actually join, again, a fighting force that's going to someday liberate the Uyghur homeland from Chinese rule. I completely understand why Uyghur activists want to distance themselves from this group, but I think it's important to recognize this group exists and to really expose what this group actually is. And I think, a lot of the people that I interviewed who had been in Syria and had left the group to come to Turkey realized that it was not a group that was going to liberate the Uyghur homeland, but it was essentially a mercenary group that was serving, other patrons in Syria. So yeah, I think it's important to discuss these groups because what you get again from people who are trying to deny what's happening to Uyghurs in China is they'll immediately show these videos, and the Chinese state has created also recently several videos about the Uyghur terrorist threat to kind of associate these people with the reasoning for their crackdown on Uyghurs. But what I think the final and probably most important point is these groups have never been influential inside the Uyghur homeland. And in fact, they produce videos that applaud Uyghurs who carry out violence against the Chinese state. But they do not have any, there's no evidence that they were ever behind any of these violent acts. And I think that, for the Chinese state, the justification that there's a Uyghur terrorist threat inside the population is the key to why they're essentially destroying Uyghur culture. And I don't see much evidence that ever really existed.
Yeah, my interpretation of the attacks between 2013 to about 2015-16 are people that were just frustrated, had nothing left, all their family was destroyed, and they basically wanted to seek like lone revenge. Would you see it that way? It's not necessarily there's an organization telling them, like it was strategized. It was like for example, Kunming. It was a strategized attack. Like, I don't see it that way. Would you agree, or?
More or less. I think there's two things and it's important to kind of distinguish between these. I think initially from 2009 on, what you see particularly in the south of the Uyghur region is very much akin to what we're seeing African Americans push back at in the United States, is that where there's such a heavy security presence in Uyghur population centers that are heavily surveilling and harassing Uyghurs, that you have, I think, a lot of spontaneous violence between Uyghurs and the police. And there's a whole, I see this as kind of an escalating thing from 2009 to 2013. Then you do see a couple of these events that per my definition look like terrorist acts in the sense that they are targeting innocent civilians, and in particular, you mentioned the Kunming attack where you had Uyghurs allegedly stabbing civilians in the train station. But there's no evidence that these events were ever the brainchild of any organization. And in fact, when you kind of deconstruct each of them, there's multiple possible explanations for what happened. In the Kunming instance, for example, what was happening at that time is you had almost an underground railroad of Uyghurs who were leaving through Yunnan province into Southeast Asia, trying to get to Turkey, just fleeing the region because of the police violence in their native villages and the duress they were feeling there. And it seems that this group of people who went into the train station were potentially being trailed by security forces because they were trying to cross the border and they were discovered. And so maybe that was just kind of a kind of an act of final glory, and it certainly should be seen as, I think, a terrorist attack. But there should be a distinction between terrorist attacks that have some sort of organization and planning behind them, and what you kind of mentioned is lone wolf attacks, and that comes out of frustration, alienation, and we've seen that in the West a lot. The Boston Marathon bombing, was two very alienated young Muslim immigrants who identified, with things they saw in the media and abroad, and carried out violence in that name. So, I think, I do think that it's important to contextualize those, and it's also important to actually document them and how many there were.
Yeah.
Because some of them, as I said, don't even look like terrorist attacks and don't look like premeditated violence at all. It's just, you have police coming to your house to search your house, and somebody, gets violent, and there's a violent incident, which is very similar to what you would find anywhere in the world. And then there's some of these attacks that look like they were meant to make a political statement and did attack civilians.
Well, what do you make of the Tiananmen Square attack? And then there was this like poorly produced video afterwards, and then you also have prisoners mentioning the names of these groups while they're interviewed. Obviously, we know that they went through a bunch of duress before they were tortured, like before they were interviewed.
Yeah.
Many people, as stupid as it sounds, many people buy into this CCP propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, and I'm not surprised they buy into it because, I find that the entire portrayal of terrorists globally is very problematic. I think I'm one of my future projects is looking at, in comparative context, a couple groups like the Uyghurs, the Chechens, the Uzbeks, who have ended up with these jihadist groups abroad. But to try to figure out how that happened and why, and what their real purpose in doing so was. I think that, so for that reason, you see these things, and it does look, and I think this is one of the reasons scholars have shied away from actually analyzing this violence, because there's kind of a fear, as I think you mentioned earlier with activists. You don't want to be seen as an apologist for terrorists, because terrorists have been branded as such an evil force in the world. But I think you really have to deconstruct these things. The Tiananmen Square incident, I got a lot of hot water with China's netizens after I wrote a opinion piece on that for CNN.com, where I was merely pointing out that, this did not look like a sophisticated terrorist attack, of an international jihadist group.
Yeah.
It was a family of Uyghurs, including, I think, a mother-in-law, husband and wife, driving an SUV into Tiananmen Square. And they ended up dying. I think they killed one tourist. I can't remember exactly. But this became a huge symbol of the Uyghur terrorist threat for the Chinese state. And I think largely because of the symbolism of this actually coming into Tiananmen Square, where, anything that they saw as a threat from a violent threat of Uyghurs in the past had happened in the Uyghur region, which for most Chinese people, that's as far away as they can think. They've never even been there. They don't really know what it is like at all. So this created, I think, a lot of hysteria. But it's very difficult to know what was really happening. There was one expert in terrorism from the UK, Raphael Pantucci, who put out a very interesting article about this when it happened, kind of an analysis, inconclusive because we don't really have concrete information from the Chinese government. But, he was saying that one possibility was these people were actually not trying to kill others at all, but it was more like the Tibetan self-immolation. They were trying to commit an act of suicide by killing themselves to make a political statement. But we, in all of these events, unfortunately, we have so little reliable information, and I certainly don't believe the video interviews you see when people have been interrogated, probably tortured, who'll say virtually anything that they're told to say. But I do not see any evidence that the Turkestan Islamic Party was behind that.
Yeah. We'll sort of wind down now. Last sort of two questions. One, this is happening to the Uyghurs now, and we slowly see it happening sort of India, sort of doing the same thing to the Kashmiris. And we could see other countries with indigenous populations also be, for example, buying Chinese technologies. And I would imagine a lot of countries or the dictators of other countries would love to have the power that China has to enforce this. Mm-hmm. And number two, what is the solution? I mean, we could talk about the atrocities all day. What is the solution? You sort of mentioned a solution towards the end, sort of economically, and saying that worked for apartheid, against the apartheid regime in South Africa. But obviously the apartheid regime in South Africa is totally different to the 21st century China that we're looking at.
Yeah. So
yeah, first, it's happening to the Uyghurs. It can happen to others, and then the solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So first, I find this to be a very dangerous precedent in the world. I do not study Chinese state decision making. I'll leave that to my political science colleagues. But I wonder, in retrospect, to what degree the Chinese state looked at what Myanmar did to the Rohingya, and the lack of international attention to that, and thought, well, why couldn't we do that to the Uyghurs? People have since said the same thing about India's reaction in Kashmir this past year. I think the reason we have international norms is to to prevent things from replicating like this, to prevent mass atrocities from happening. And so, if there is no response, I do feel that it's a very dangerous, it could have a very dangerous legacy in all kinds of other places. I think that it is important, obviously, for states to take a stance on this. I would love to see the United Nations actually be able to hold China accountable for this, but it's very difficult to see that happening because the United Nations is an organization of states. And China has a very prominent role on the UN Security Council. So in the same way that the UN has never been successful in preventing the US from anything, like the invasion of Iraq, I don't expect it to necessarily be successful in stopping China from what it's doing. We have seen Western states take a stance on this. And one of the unfortunate things is, we're seeing the United States take more and more of a stance on this at a time where the U.S. government is very evidently mounting a general campaign against China. So that's also kind of served to discredit what's the U.S. says, because they'd say, well, the Trump administration's just demonizing China everywhere. So, why do we believe them about the Uyghurs? And I think most importantly, this issue should not be a geopolitical football. It should not be used in geopolitical competition. It should be a humanitarian issue. What I'd like to see more states in the developing world take a stance on this. Unfortunately, the Chinese state's soft power in the developing world is very, very strong right now. And to expect a state that might be receiving a lot of economic benefits from its relationship with China to do something based on humanitarian concern, it is a difficult thing to ask. I think that most of these states don't want to do that. They don't want to rock the boat. I do hope that we'll see more reaction from the Muslim world. I think we're starting to see that on the grassroots level. And, this is all getting to the point that, I advocate in the book that really to hold China accountable, there has to be a grassroots movement. So it has to involve people putting pressure on their country's governments to speak out about this. And, the analogy to the anti-apartheid movement that I mentioned is really a kind of consumer-based advocacy, because I feel that the one thing that might change Beijing's behavior is if they feel that their major global strength, which is economic reach, is threatened. Yeah. So if there's a way, to really put pressure on Chinese companies that have gotten entangled in this, and that involves, a significant amount of China's commercial sector, particularly given the labor programs where Uyghurs are being used in factories all over, and also putting pressure on Western brands. We just saw H&M remove itself from its supplier in the Uyghur region of China. Because that was due to pressure. And I do think that kind of pressure, the one thing about the 21st century is that kind of pressure might be much quicker and much more effective than it was in the 1980s, precisely because of the internet. You can quickly cause a stir when you are able to document that a global brand is complicit in cultural genocide. and mass atrocities. And so I think that any kind of attempt to get institutions also to divest, that was part of the anti-apartheid movement. Is, it turned out a lot of universities invested their endowments in South African companies. Right now, a lot of U.S. universities and probably universities globally invest in Chinese companies that are directly involved in repression against the Uyghurs. So, really, really trying to hit those economic levers. But I think, in the end, it requires, every strategy possible to put as much pressure on China to change its behavior here.
I'll just get one question from one of our followers, and then I'll sort of end the show. It says, what could be the situation of Uyghurs and other Turkic peoples in 10 years? I won't even say 10 years, maybe in a few years' time. You know how we're looking for, say, with COVID, we're hoping that, in a year's time, everything will go back to normal. Where do you see the Uyghurs? What sort of situation would they be in a few years' time, or perhaps in the next following year or so?
Well, I mean, I'm very concerned about Uyghurs and other indigenous groups of the Uyghur region inside China. I think that we will. I remember when this first started. We a lot of different scholars, we were communicating on internet about what was happening, and one person had suggested, this place is gonna look like Uzbekistan, where you're gonna have everybody assimilated. At the time and now I don't believe that's what it's gonna look like. I don't think I think the Soviet attempt at assimilation was nowhere near as heavy-handed. It was incentivized, and so you were able to hold on to being an Uzbek, even if you spoke Russian and drank vodka. I think the situation in China is such that I'm more concerned that the situation of Uyghurs and other indigenous peoples in the Uyghur region may look more like indigenous peoples around the world who've been marginalized, depopulated, I think a lot of those communities have become more strong with time. So I mean, not even looking at Aboriginal people in Australia or Native Americans today, but looking at them, 100 years ago, maybe even 150 years ago, right after they had undergone all of these kinds of mass atrocities. So that's what I worry about. I worry that, you're going to see people primarily marginalized in their own homeland, depopulated, displaced from their native hometowns, and the only ones who are able to operate at all, will have to be heavily assimilated into Chinese culture and speak Chinese language. And so, I think the Uyghur people, as we know them inside China, I'm worried that they're going to essentially disappear, with time if the present situation continues. That said, I also think it's really important to remember that there is a significant Uyghur population outside their homeland, and those people I don't think are going to disappear, and they're probably going to become a stronger voice. And I also think that it is the Uyghur people in diaspora who are the big hope to really change this situation and to keep attention on it in the global arena. So I think, I think we're not going to see the disappearance of Uyghur identity entirely. The question is whether we'll see that inside China.
Dr. Sean Roberts, I've taken up 90 minutes of your time. I really do appreciate it. My followers also do. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I'm really happy to discuss this book with a Uyghur, because I think that you're going to be the best judge of whether I've told this story correctly.
Yeah, and just for the people, if I get many questions about what should I read and how can I know about the situation. If you guys want like a quick read with this book, essentially, if you just read the preface and the introduction and chapter 6, that pretty much gives you a gist of what's been happening recently. But this whole book, which is about 250, 300 pages, it gives you a whole modern history of about 250 years. And this book will pretty much, it gives you, in my perspective, the best summary out there so far. There are many other books, but with regards to it coming out in 2020, the most recent, the most modern version of what's happening to the Uyghurs, make sure you guys get it on Amazon. You can get it on Kindle for about $10, under $10, and the actual book for about $30. So please make sure you guys check that out. I will add the Amazon link under this thread. So make sure you guys check that out. So I want to thank, obviously, Mr. Dr. Sean Roberts and everybody else for joining. Make sure you guys like, share, subscribe to this video and our channel. And until next time, guys, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.